Not those exact words. The elder never used those words. But the ceremony said it clearly enough, in the way that rituals always say things without saying them, through silence, through the careful turning of faces, through the particular stillness of people who have all agreed beforehand on what they are watching. She had known something was coming. For weeks, the air in the longhouse had felt different. Her mother moved around her like she was furniture. Her father answered questions with the shortest possible words. Other orcs her age laughed too quickly when they saw her, and then found somewhere else to be. She noticed all of it, and pushed the noticing down somewhere deep, because the alternative was to understand what it meant, and she was not ready for that. She was ready for it now, because she had no choice. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, because the ending of this story is something that has not happened in 200 years. And once you hear it, you will understand why everyone in that clan square went completely silent. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These stories reach places we never expect. Now, let's begin. The clan square in those days was a wide, flat circle of packed earth surrounded by standing stones, each one carved with the names of every elder who had ever led Clan Ashvale. The stones had been there so long that moss had grown into the carved letters, turning them green, making the names look like they had been written in living things. Gralk had played around those stones as a child, tracing the letters with her fingers, asking her grandmother to read her the names. She had never imagined standing in the center of that circle for reasons like this. Elder Gorath stood at the far edge of the ring, dressed in his ceremonial skins, the long black bones of the Ashvale ancestors hanging across his chest in a pattern that was meant to look ancient and heavy. Gorath was old. His green skin had gone the color of old copper, and his tusks had yellowed at the roots. He had been elder of Clan Ashvale since before Grauk was born, and in all that time she could not remember him ever smiling. Not at a naming ceremony, not at a victory celebration, not at a harvest of victory celebration, not at a harvest. He watched events the way a hawk watches a field, still, patient, calculating. He was watching her like that now. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her father had always told her to stand when things were difficult. "Hold yourself up," he had said many times. "No matter what happens around you, hold yourself up." She had thought he meant it generally, as advice. Something a father says to his daughter when he wants her to have a backbone. She understood now that he had been preparing her for this specific morning. Around her, the clan stood in a ring, 300 faces at every angle, the elders nearest to Gorath, and the children pressed at the back near the firebreak. She looked for her parents and found them almost immediately, because some part of her had known exactly where they would be. They stood together at the outer edge, slightly apart from the others, and neither of them was looking at her. Her mother's eyes were fixed on the ground, somewhere near her own feet. Her father's jaw was set hard, his gaze pointed at a stone past Gorath's left shoulder. Neither of them moved. Neither of them showed any expression she could read. Grauk looked at them for 3 full seconds, and then looked away. Gorath began to speak in the old tongue, the formal language used only for rituals and judgments, the sounds older than the clan itself, older than the standing stones. Gralk had studied enough of it to follow the meaning, and the meaning was exactly what she had been afraid of. She was being cut from the clan's record. Her name would be removed from the founding stone. She was to take nothing that belonged to the clan, which was almost everything she owned. She was to cross the boundary stones before the sun reached the midpoint of the sky. And she was not to return. The reason Gorath gave was not specific. It never was in these ceremonies. He spoke about purity of blood, about the clan's obligation to itself, about the burden of decisions that fell to elders who understood things the young could not. His voice was even, practiced. He had done this before. She listened to every word. She made herself listen, even to the parts that were clearly designed to be unhearable. The formal declarations of severance, each one a small, precise cut. The kind of language that works not because of what it says, but because of who is watching it being said, and what they do next. Which was nothing. The crowd did nothing. They stood and listened, and their faces remained arranged, and that was the ceremony's real content. 300 people collectively deciding that whatever they had once owed her, they did not owe it anymore. She thought about a girl from her childhood, an orc named Tulla, who had been expelled when Gralk was 9 years old. She had stood in this same square and watched that ceremony without understanding what she was seeing, only sensing that it was terrible, and not asking questions about it afterward, because even at 9, she understood that the questions were not welcome. She had thought about Tulla occasionally since then, wondered where she had gone, whether she had survived. Nobody in the clan spoke about her. Her name had been removed from the founding stone so thoroughly that within 2 years it was as if she had never existed at all. Gralk looked at the founding stone now, at the carvings she had traced as a child, and understood that her own name would be removed from it before the sun set today. Someone would be given the tool. They would do it carefully, the way administrative things are done carefully in a clan that values its records. They might feel something while they did it, or they might not. Either way, the name would be gone, and the stone would close over the absence the way skin closes over a cut. And within 2 years, nobody would remember the exact placement of the letters. That was what the ceremony was actually for. When he finished, he simply looked at her and waited. Around her, the crowd was absolutely still. There were many things Gralk wanted to do in that moment. She wanted to ask why, directly and clearly, and make him answer in front of everyone. She wanted to find her parents in the crowd and demand that they look at her. She wanted to say something, anything, that would crack the composed surface of this performance and reveal it for what it actually was. She did none of those things. She breathed in once, slow and controlled, the way her grandmother had taught her years ago. "Feel the ground under your feet," her grandmother used to say. "When everything else is moving, the ground is still there. Feel it. That's something nobody can take." She felt the ground, packed earth, dry, the weight of her own body pressing into it. Then she turned and walked toward the boundary stones. The crowd parted without speaking. They moved aside in small steps, giving her just enough room to pass, and each face she moved past was carefully arranged into neutrality. Not cruelty, not anger, not even guilt. Just blankness. The particular blankness of people who have collectively decided not to be present for something. She walked through them slowly, her back straight, her breathing even, and the space she passed through closed up behind her like water. At the boundary stones, she stopped for one moment. She had not planned to stop. Her intention had been to walk through without pausing, to give Gorath nothing to read. But she stopped, and she turned, and she looked back at the clan square one last time. Not at Gorath, not at the crowd, but at her parents. Her father had finally raised his gaze from the stone behind Gorath's shoulder. He was looking at her now, just briefly, and for a fraction of a second his face showed something. She could not name it exactly. It was too complicated and too fast, and then it was gone. His jaw was hard again. His eyes dropped. Her mother never looked up at all. Gralk crossed the boundary stones. The sounds of the clan, the fire, the birds in the longhouse thatch, the distant rhythms of daily work, cut off almost immediately behind her. The Ashenwood began where the clan ended, and it began without transition. One step she was on cleared ground with the smoke of clan fires faintly in the air, and the next step she was among the old trees, and the canopy was overhead, and everything was different. The Ashenwood had a reputation that every orc child in Clan Ashvale learned young. Not a reputation for danger, exactly, though it was dangerous. More than that, the elders called it a wrong place. A place where the usual rules did not hold, where the spirits that had governed the old ways still moved through the undergrowth without caring who they disturbed. Hunting parties avoided it. No clan had ever settled within it. There were stories about the things that lived in its deeper sections, though nobody who repeated those stories had ever actually gone far enough to know for certain. Grok had always been curious about it as a child, in the way children are curious about places they are forbidden. She had stood at the boundary stones and peered in and thought it looked like any other forest, just trees, just shadow and light. She had not understood then what older orcs meant when they said the place felt wrong. She understood it now, within her first hour. It was not a visual thing. The trees were trees, ash and ironwood and ancient deadfall rotting back into the earth, nothing unusual. The light filtered through in the same patterns it did in any dense forest. The smells were ordinary, bark, soil, something green and wet. But there was a quality to the air underneath all of that, something she had no word for yet, a kind of attention, as though the forest was processing her presence, not threatening, not welcoming, just aware. She pushed the feeling aside and focused on what she needed: shelter for the night, water, anything that could be eaten without fire. She found a creek by sound near dusk on the first day, and she drank until the worst of her thirst was gone, then followed it until she found a place where a fallen ironwood had created a natural lean-to of bark and deadfall. She crawled underneath it, pulled her knees to her chest, and stayed there while the forest went dark. She did not sleep easily. The sounds of the Ashenwood at night were different from the sounds of the surrounding wilds. There was a layering to them, a depth, as if multiple things were moving through the same space, but not at the same time. The sounds folding over each other in patterns that did not quite resolve into anything recognizable. She lay still and listened, and forced her breathing to slow down. And eventually, a kind of exhausted numbness took over, and she drifted. She woke once, near the middle of the night, to a sound she could not place. A low, resonant hum, very distant, more felt in the chest than heard with the ears, like the vibration of something enormous a long way off. She lay still and listened until it faded. She did not know what it was. She filed it away next to all the other things she did not know yet, and went back to trying to sleep. The cold was worse after that, the kind that settles in at the lowest point of the night, getting into the joints and the bones rather than just the surface of the skin. She had no blanket, she had nothing. She had left the clan with the clothes she was wearing in the square and nothing else, and she had known this was a possibility. Had thought about it abstractly in the weeks before, in the way you think about something you cannot yet fully believe. And thinking about it abstractly had not prepared her for the physical reality of spending a night in the Ashenwood in late autumn, with no shelter beyond a lean-to of deadfall, and no warmth beyond what her own body could produce. She pulled her knees tighter, and thought about Yurka, not with any particular direction, just the presence of her. The way her house had always been warm, the particular smell of it. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, the residue of whatever Yurka had been burning in the small clay bowl she kept on the shelf, something from the forest that Grauk had never identified. She had spent hundreds of hours in that house, and never once thought about what it would mean to not be able to go there anymore. She thought about it now. She dreamed of her grandmother. Not a real memory. Yurka had died when Grauk was 11, and the details of her had blurred in the years since. the specific sound of her voice going soft while the feeling of her remained. But in the dream she was vivid and complete. Sitting across a fire in the posture Grauk remembered. That particular stillness she had. The way she seemed to take up less space than she actually occupied. She was looking at Grauk with an expression that Grauk had seen on her face before. Not concern exactly, but close attention. The expression of someone measuring a situation carefully. She said nothing in the dream. She only pointed. Grauk followed the direction of the pointing into darkness. And then the dream dissolved, and the forest sounds came back, and the cold came back, and she was awake again. And the sky through the gaps in the deadfall above her was the pale grey of very early morning. She lay there for a while, thinking about her grandmother. Jurka had been different from the rest of the clan, in ways that Grauk had noticed as a child, but not understood. She lived slightly apart from the longhouses, in a smaller structure she had built herself, and she had her own fire and her own work, and other clan members came to see her, for reasons they did not discuss openly. Grauk had spent more time there than at home, learning things. How to read weather, how to find water, the names and uses of plants, the old language and the old songs. She'd never thought to ask why her grandmother knew all of this. It had seemed simply like something her grandmother knew. After Jurka died, Elder Gorath had overseen the clearing of her house. Grauk had not been allowed to attend. When she asked her father what had been done with Jurka's things, he had told her they had been returned to the forest, the way it was done. She had accepted this at 11 years old without questioning it. She had not thought about it again until now. She thought about it now. She got up when the light was strong enough to move by, drank again from the creek, found a patch of ironwood mushrooms she recognized from Jurka's lessons, and ate them cautiously. Then she started walking. She was not walking toward anything she could name. That was the strangest part of the second day, and she spent a long time trying to understand it. She had no destination, no map, no direction, no plan beyond basic survival. Logically, she should have been moving outward, toward the forest's edge, toward open country, toward any place that was not the Ashenwood. Every practical thought she had pointed that way, but she kept walking deeper in. It was not reckless. It felt less like a decision than a pull. The same kind of feeling she got sometimes when a sound was just at the edge of her hearing. The involuntary tilt of the head toward it, the body orienting before the mind had agreed. She tried turning south twice, and found herself drifting east again within 100 steps, without quite knowing how it had happened. On the third attempt, she stood still for a long time and paid attention to the sensation, trying to locate it physically in her body. It was in her left hand, specifically in the palm of her left hand, in the birthmark she had carried her whole life, a raised mark roughly the size of a coin, dark against her green skin, shaped like something that was almost a letter in the old script, but not quite. She had never thought much about it. Birthmarks were birthmarks. But now, standing in the Ashenwood on the second day of her exile, she realized that the pull she was feeling was centered there, in that spot, warm in a way that her palm had not been warm before. She held her hand open and looked at the mark. Nothing visible had changed. It looked the same as always. But the warmth was real and undeniable, and it was pulling her east. And she was tired of fighting it. She walked east. She found it near midday on the second day, and she almost walked past it. The forest in that section was old, older than the parts she had moved through before, the trees wider and more widely spaced, the undergrowth lower and darker. Vines hung from every branch and ran across the ground in thick ropes. And in many places, they had colonized the spaces between trees to create walls of living green that blocked the sightlines in every direction. She had been pushing through these curtains for an hour, each step wet and slow. and she was tired enough that her attention had narrowed to the next few feet in front of her, and nothing else. Then, she came through a particularly dense section, and the vines fell away, and she was standing in a small clearing. And across the clearing, almost invisible against the tree line, was a structure. She stopped. Her first thought was that it was a formation of stone, boulders dragged together by some geological event into an accidental shape. But she stayed still and let her eyes adjust to the light, and the accidental shape became deliberate. Walls, a roof line, corners that were too precise to be natural. It was a building, roughly circular, made of dark stone fitted together without mortar, the gaps between the stones sealed with something black and fibrous that she could not identify from a distance. The vines that covered it had grown into it rather than over it. They did not cover it so much as incorporate it, as though the building and the vines had grown together over a very long time. The effect was that the structure seemed to emerge from the forest rather than standing within it, as if the trees had produced it the way they produced bark or root. There was no door. She circled the structure completely before accepting this. She moved along its outer wall with one hand almost touching the stone, looking for any gap or seam that could indicate an entrance. There was nothing. The wall was continuous. The stones fitted so well that in most places a finger could not be pushed between them. Whatever was inside, if anything was inside, had been sealed in. Or sealed out. She came back around to her starting point and stood facing the wall. The warmth in her palm had become something closer to heat. She pressed her left hand flat against the stone. For a moment, nothing. Cold rock, moss under her fingers, the ordinary texture of old stone. Then, the mark on her palm lit up, not dramatically, not with any explosion or sound, just light, the same light as an ember right before it catches, orange gold. Steady. It spread from the raised edges of the mark in her palm into the stone beneath her hand, traveling through the fitted gaps between the blocks like water finding channels, illuminating the mortar-like substance in thin, bright lines that ran upward from her hand in branching patterns until the entire section of wall in front of her was traced in glowing lines. She pulled her hand back. The light faded slowly. She put her hand back. It returned. She held it there and watched the lines extend and branch and connect. And gradually, she saw that the branching was not random. It was a pattern. A single, complex pattern she was seeing only part of at a time. She took a step back and watched the section she could see without touching. And even without contact, the lines stayed faintly visible in the stone. They matched her birthmark exactly. Not the overall shape, the exact texture of it. Every raised edge, every subtle variation, every place where the mark had always seemed to her like it was almost a letter but not quite. Each of those imprecisions was echoed perfectly in the stone, as though the mark in her palm had been copied from something carved here long before she was born. She put her hand back against the wall. She heard a sound like very deep water moving over stone, felt a tremor through the rock and through the ground beneath her feet, and the section of wall in front of her shifted. It did not hinge or swing. It sank, drew back a few inches into the structure, and then slid sideways, smoothly and silently, and a doorway appeared. Beyond it was darkness and air that moved outward past her face, cool and dry, carrying a smell she had never encountered before. Not unpleasant. Something old, something preserved. Like the smell of a scroll that has been sealed for a very long time. She stood in the doorway and looked into the dark. Then she stepped inside. The light followed her in. Not the glow from her palm. That faded as soon as she moved her hand. But a different light, ambient, sourceless. The same orange gold that spread through the stone when she touched it, now emanating from the walls themselves at a low level, just enough to see by. It was as if the building had recognized her and decided to accommodate her, and she tried not to spend too much time thinking about what that meant. The interior was a single round room, the ceiling high enough that the space felt open despite the stone walls. The floor was fitted stone as well, laid in a circular pattern that radiated out from a central point, like rings in water. Along the walls, shelves had been carved directly into the rock, not added later. Carved when the structure was built, the stone shaped to hold things. Most of the shelves held objects covered in heavy cloth that had gone stiff with age. Some held tools whose shapes she recognized from Yurka's house, bone-handled instruments, ceramic bowls sealed with wax, coils of something that was either very old rope or something that had once been living. Near the back wall, a set of stone shelves held scrolls wrapped in treated hide, dozens of them, their ends stamped with symbols she could not read. She moved through the room carefully, not touching anything yet, taking stock. She stopped at the first shelf and crouched to look more carefully at the covered objects. One of the cloths had slipped slightly from the object beneath it, and the object was visible at one edge. Dark ceramic, the lip of a bowl or a vessel, etched with the same script as the scrolls on the far shelves. The etching was not decorative. It was text, small and dense, covering the visible surface completely. She did not touch it. She moved on. The tools on the lower shelves were more familiar in form, if not in function. Handles made for orc hands, blades and scrapers and instruments whose purpose she could guess from their shapes. All of them heavier than the ones she had seen in Yurka's house, all carrying the signs of long, careful use before they had been placed here. They were not rusted. Whatever the black, fibrous material was that sealed the walls, it kept the air inside the hut dry enough that nothing had corroded in 200 years. She looked at the scrolls for a long time without touching them. They were numerous enough to represent a life's work, perhaps more than one life, more than one generation of collecting and writing and adding to what was already there. She could read the script on the visible ends of some of them, the marking symbols that indicated contents or author or both. Several of them bore the same mark. She could not read it yet. She noted it and moved on. And then she saw the chest. It was in the center of the room, directly over the central point of the floor pattern, as though the entire floor had been designed to indicate it. It was made of some dark wood she could not name, banded with metal that had kept its color while everything around it had aged. The bands still bright, the wood still solid. It was not large. She could have carried it under one arm, but something about the way it was placed, the deliberate centrality of it, made it feel more important than its size suggested. She walked toward it and crouched in front of it. The light in the walls brightened slightly, as if responding to her closeness. On the lid of the chest, carved deep into the wood in letters she recognized because they were in the old script her grandmother had taught her, was a single word, her name. Not carved recently. The edges of the letters had the smoothed look of very old carving, the kind that comes from a century of air and touch. The wood around the cuts darkened with age, or the cuts themselves had gone pale. She ran her finger along the letters and felt their depth. These had been made with force, with intention, cut deep enough to last. Her name. Her exact name. Carved into a chest in a sealed building in the middle of a forest that no orc had entered in living memory. Cut into wood at least a century old. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked for a latch and found none. She looked for a lock and found none. She tried the lid, and it lifted freely, as if it had been waiting for her weight. Inside the chest, there was a single object. A smooth river stone, dark grey, roughly oval, sitting on a bed of folded cloth. She had seen stones like this before. Her grandmother had kept one on a shelf in her house, and Grolk had asked about it once. And Yurka had said only that it was a listening stone, that she would explain when the time was right. The time had apparently never been right, because Yurka had died before she explained it. Grolk reached into the chest and picked up the stone. The moment her fingers closed around it, the room changed. The ambient light in the walls surged briefly, then steadied at a higher level. The air shifted, a change in pressure, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm when something in the atmosphere decides. And from the center of the room, from the central point of the floor pattern directly behind where the chest stood, a shape began to form. It was not sudden. It assembled itself slowly, the way smoke forms a column before it disperses, rising from the floor and taking on density and definition over the course of a full minute, while Grolk stood completely still with the stone in both hands and watched it happen. When it was finished, her grandmother was standing in front of her. Not Yurka, as she had been at the end, in those last months when she had been small and still and fading. Yurka, as she had been when Grolk was very young. Upright, solid, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes the deep amber that Grolk had inherited, and that she had always loved in herself because she had thought it came from her grandmother. She was translucent in the way that light through deep water is translucent, not invisible, not fully present, but undeniably there. She looked at Grolk with the same expression from the dream, the expression of someone measuring a situation carefully. She said, in a voice that Grolk heard not with her ears but somewhere behind them, "I have been here for a long time. I am glad you found your way." Grolk sat down on the floor. Her legs had not quite decided to hold her. Yurka, the shape of Yurka, the presence that called itself Yurka, moved to the far side of the chest and settled into a posture that was familiar. The one from all those childhood hours in the house near the boundary stones. She waited while Grolk steadied herself. That had always been one of her gifts, the patience that did not feel like waiting, but like simply being present. When Grolk could speak, she asked the first question that came. Why? Not the ceremony, not Gorath, not the mechanics of it. Why? The whole of it, all of it. Yurka was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother knew what you were before you were 3 years old. She came to me terrified, and I told her the truth. And she spent the next 15 years trying to figure out what to do with the truth. What happened this morning is what she decided. It took her a long time." Grolk stared at her. "What I was? What does that mean?" "It means," Yurka said, "that the thing Gorath has been afraid of for 40 years walked past him this morning in the clan square. And he let it go because your parents made him believe it was his idea." She understood some of it that day, and more of it over the days that followed, as the spirit in the stone hut spoke to her, and the pieces assembled themselves into a picture she had not imagined. The story went back 200 years, to a time when Clan Ashvale had been something different. Not a single fortified settlement, but a loose network of families spread across the Ashenwood and the country around it, held together less by formal leadership than by a tradition of shamanic guidance that ran through certain bloodlines and not others. The shamans in those days were not ceremonial figures. They were practical ones, readers of land and weather and the older kinds of knowledge that had no name in common speech. The things passed between generations through teaching and through blood. The most important of these at that time had been a shaman named Kishara. Yurka's voice shifted when she said the name, not with reverence exactly, though that was part of it, more with the particular register of someone naming a thing they have carried for a very long time. Kishara had been the last in a line of shamans that stretched back further than the clan's written records. She had been the most powerful of them by most accounts, though she herself had reportedly been uncomfortable with that framing. She had not thought of the ability as power, Yurka said. She had thought of it as a relationship, with the land, with the accumulated experience of the dead, with something underneath both of those that she had various names for, and that did not translate well into the language they were speaking now. What Kishara had done, at the end of her life, was write everything down. Every technique, every lineage, every name and location and method of the shamanic tradition as she understood it. She had also done something else, something that had seemed eccentric to those around her at the time, and that had turned out to be the most important thing she ever did. She had built this hut. Gralk looked at the walls around her and understood suddenly that they were old in a way she had not fully registered before. Not merely old. 200 years old. Built and sealed, and left here in this clearing, by someone who had known, somehow, impossibly, that it would be needed. She built it for you, Yurka said simply. She could not know your name or your face, but she understood the nature of the bloodline well enough to know what form the next one would take, and she prepared accordingly. Gralk was quiet for a long time after that. Then, my parents knew. Your mother knew, Yurka said. Your father suspected. They were put in an impossible position. A child with abilities that the current elder, Gorath, had spent his entire tenure actively suppressing. He was not the first elder to do this. The tradition of suppressing the shamanic bloodlines in Clan Ashvale goes back 4 generations. Gorath was simply the most sophisticated at it. He never used force. He used administration, ceremonies, records. The very apparatus of clan governance turned into a tool for controlling what he could not eliminate. Why? Gralk said again, but with more specificity this time. Why would an elder fear this? Yurka's expression was something complicated, because a shaman of this line does not answer to an elder, she said. That is not disrespect or rebellion. It is simply the nature of the relationship. The old ways do not recognize the authority of a single clan leader. They recognize the land and the accumulated knowledge of the ancestors and the living needs of the people. Those things sometimes align with what an elder wants. Sometimes they do not. Gorath understood this well enough to know that the presence of a true shaman in his clan would mean the permanent end of certain kinds of control. And my parents. They expelled me to protect me. Your mother arranged for Gorath to believe the expulsion was his own conclusion, Yurka said. She spent months guiding his thinking, presenting evidence here and there, supporting the reasoning that pointed toward a ritual exclusion rather than something more permanent. She gave him a clean solution, and he took it. She needed you outside the clan before he understood what he had let go. Gralk sat with this. She thought about her mother's face in the clan square, fixed on the ground. The specific quality of it. Not shame, she realized now. Not grief. Something much more controlled than either of those. The expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was executing it carefully, knowing that any deviation could unravel a plan of years. And her father's gaze. The one that had lasted 3 seconds before he looked away. She thought she understood that too now. The same deliberate control. The cost of it visible for just long enough that she had seen it. I hated them this morning, she said. I know, Yurka said. I don't know what I feel now. That's appropriate. Take your time with it. The preparation is here, she said, gesturing at the walls, the shelves, the scrolls. Everything Keshra wrote, everything I added to it in my years here after I died, everything the spirits of our line have been maintaining in this place while they waited for you. It is all here. The question is whether you want to learn it." Grauk looked at the stone in her hands, the smooth grey oval. She turned it over once. "Yes," she said. What followed was not easy to describe in terms of hours and days, though it lasted 3 full rotations of light and dark. And when it was over, Grauk had not slept more than fragments, had not eaten, was thinner than she had been, and felt more awake than she had ever felt in her life. The teaching came through the stone, through Yurka's voice, and through the voices of others she came to recognize. Older, different, some of them not quite speaking in words, but in something adjacent to words. Sensation and image, and the particular quality of memory that belongs to someone else and yet feels directly known. Kashara was among them at certain hours, and her presence was different from the others in a way that was hard to name. More patient, more complete, less interested in the mechanics of what was being transmitted, and more interested in whether it was landing correctly. The first thing she learned to feel was the ground. Not in the ordinary sense. She had always felt the ground. That was just sensation. This was different. This was the ground as a record, a surface that had absorbed and retained every significant event that had occurred on it, the way stone retains warmth after the sun has gone. She sat in the center of the hut floor with her palms flat on the fitted stone and learned to go quiet enough to read what was there. The first time she succeeded, she saw the clearing outside as it had been when Kashara built the hut. The trees were different, shorter, younger. The species different in places where they had died and been replaced. Kashara herself was there. Indistinct, her outline more impression than image, moving around the perimeter of the clearing with deliberate steps as she laid the foundation stones. The clarity of it was extraordinary. Not a story being told to her, a recording she was present inside. She pulled back from it, shaking. "That is the memory of the land," Yurka said. "It goes in all directions from there, centuries backward if you go deep enough. Be careful with depth until you understand how to come back." She practiced coming back, in and out, shorter excursions first, learning the feel of the boundary between what was recorded in the land and what was present in her own body. It was the most important thing she learned in those 3 days, Yurka told her. The return. Many people who encountered this ability for the first time found the depth of it too compelling and stayed in it too long, until the ordinary present felt thin and distant and not worth returning to. That was the failure mode of this kind of seeing. The land did not compel you to stay. You compelled yourself. The discipline was choosing, every time, to come back. She chose, every time, to come back. On the second day, she went further back in the land's memory and found the history of her own line. Not the version Gorath kept in the clan records, the sanitized version with the shamanic elements removed, the version in which Kashara was simply a particularly skilled herbalist who had lived in the forest and kept to herself. The actual history. The full version. The one with all the parts that official records found inconvenient. She saw the network of shamans spread across the Ashenwood as Yurka had described it, saw the teaching move between them, saw Kashara in clearer detail, a tall woman, old by the time of these recordings, moving through the forest with an ease that suggested she had walked it every day of her life. Which she had. In these visions, she also learned things about the work itself. What shamans of this line had actually done with the ability she was learning to use. It was not what she might have imagined. There was nothing dramatic about most of it. It was more like being a doctor who could not be fooled, or a judge who could not be bribed, not because of superior character, but because the ability made certain kinds of deception simply unavailable. You cannot lie to someone about the history of a place they can read directly. You cannot fabricate a dispute about water rights when the other person can feel in the land exactly where the water has always gone. You cannot hide a crime in a location where the ground will give it up to anyone with the patience to listen. This was what Gurath had been afraid of. Not power in the sense of strength or force. The ability to see clearly in a world that ran on selective blindness. She also learned, in smaller and stranger lessons, things she had not expected. The way certain plants held memory differently than others. Longer, more detailed. The kind that could be read years after the event, rather than only immediately after. The specific quality of the Ashenwood's attention, which was not consciousness in the way she understood consciousness, but was something that shared some of its features. An accumulated weight of awareness, built up over centuries of the old shamans moving through it and practicing in it and returning to it. The forest had been used as a tool of the tradition for so long that it had become one, in some functional sense. "Be careful with the forest," Yitka told her once between sessions. "It is very old, and it does not distinguish between asking and taking. You will want to stay in it sometimes. That wanting is partly you, and partly the place wanting to be known. Learn which is which." She also saw what had happened to Kashara. The end of Kashar's life had not been peaceful. The recording of it was fragmented and unclear, in the way that violent things are fragmented and unclear in memory. Pieces more than sequence. But the shape of it was legible. There had been a confrontation with an early version of the clan leadership, a dispute over the division of something. Resources, authority. She could not tell precisely. It had not ended well for Kashara, though she had survived the immediate event. What it had done was convince her to seal the line, to build the hut, to take the long view, to accept that the living could not finish this, and plan accordingly for the dead. Gralk came up from this vision with a different quality of feeling than she had gone down with. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was more specific than anger. A settled, concrete understanding of something she had only guessed at before. The forces that had shaped her life, Gorath's long project of suppression, her parents' impossible position, her own years of feeling somehow wrong-shaped for the clan she lived in, the sense that she was too much of something that could not be named. All of this had roots going back 200 years. And those roots were not mysterious or abstract. They were choices that specific people had made in specific moments. And the consequences of those choices had moved forward through time in straight lines until they arrived in that clan square on her 18th birthday. She understood this clearly on the evening of the second day, and she held the understanding without letting it become something she was overwhelmed by. And in the morning, she continued learning. On the third day, near the end, Kashara's presence in the hut was stronger than it had been before. Gralk sat in the center of the floor and felt it without quite seeing it. The way you feel the heat of a fire without looking directly at it. She asked, "Why the forehead mark?" "The mark, the tradition, is recognition," Kashara's presence said, in the not quite words she used. "For others to see, but also for you to see yourself. You will know it when it comes." She asked, "What happens after?" "Whatever you decide," Kashara said. "That is the whole of the answer. The ability is yours, and the decisions are yours, and the consequences are yours. This is not a different kind of obligation. It is the absence of obligation." Which is harder? On the morning of the fourth day, Gralk placed the listening stone back in the chest and closed the lid and stood up. The light in the walls was steady. The door was where she had come in. The scrolls and objects on the shelves had not been disturbed. She put her hand flat on the center of the floor one last time, feeling the ground, confirming the return. present, here, herself. Then she walked to the door, and the door opened for her, and she stepped out into the clearing. The ashen wood was the same, the vines, the light, the quality of attention in the air. She stood in the clearing and breathed it in and thought, I'll come back here. This is mine now. Then she started walking west, toward the clan. The walk back was 2 days. She moved without hurry, sleeping when she needed to, eating from the forest as she had in the first days, but with more precision now. She read the land as she walked, not deeply, just the surface of it. And the surface told her things. Where water was, where something had passed recently, where the older trees had their roots. She was not performing this. She was simply doing it, the way you do a thing that has become natural to you through practice, without thinking about each step. She reached the boundary stones of Clan Ashvale in the late afternoon of the second day. She stood outside them for a moment and thought about what she was walking back into. Gorath. The clan that had watched her expelled without speaking. Her parents, whose choices she still did not fully know how to hold. All the complexity of it. She thought about what Kashara had said. This is not a different kind of obligation. It is the absence of obligation, which is harder. She stepped across the boundary stones. The clan in late afternoon was busy. Cooking fires, the sounds of work, the movement of a community running its routines. She walked through the outer paths toward the clan square, without trying to hide, and without announcing herself, just walking at an ordinary pace. And she had covered perhaps half the distance before someone saw her and stopped and stared. Then another person stopped. Then a third. By the time she reached the edge of the clan square, there were perhaps 50 people behind her, not following exactly, but not going back to what they had been doing either. The news of her was moving faster than she was. Gorath was in the square. He was standing with 2 other elders near the founding stone, reviewing something. A record, she thought, or a boundary dispute of some kind. He heard the gathering sounds of people and turned. The practiced turn of a man who has learned to read crowds and does it automatically. And he saw her. She watched his face. She had expected anger. Gorath was a careful man, but the expulsion ceremony had been his performance and his authority, and she had walked back across the boundary stones he had sent her across. She expected the composure to crack into something hard. Instead, he went still. It was different from the stillness of the clan square at the ceremony, different in quality, in texture. That had been the stillness of practiced neutrality. This was something else. His eyes had fixed on her forehead, and his expression was doing something she had not seen on his face before, in all the years she had watched it from a distance. It was not a complex expression. It was simple, almost childlike. The expression of someone who has believed something was impossible and is looking at it anyway. She felt the mark on her forehead. Not the birthmark, that was on her palm. Something on her forehead that had not been there when she left. She had not seen it, had no mirror, but she felt it the way you feel warmth from a lamp. Present, steady, a small, specific pressure. She kept walking toward the center of the square. Gorath took 1 step backward, then another. His legs seemed to not be doing what he intended them to do. He reached behind him for the founding stone and found it, his hand closing on it, holding himself up with it. The other elders had turned and were watching him and not understanding what was happening. The elder of Clan Ashvale, who had run his clan for 40 years without a visible moment of uncertainty, slowly sat down on the ground. He sat down without dignity and without intending to, his legs simply folding, and he sat there in the center of the square with his hand still pressed to the founding stone, staring at her forehead with an expression that was very close to grief. From the edge of the crowd, two figures moved. She knew them before she saw them clearly, not by sight, by the specific quality of the movement. The way two people move together who have been together for a very long time, in step without trying to be. Her parents came through the gathering crowd and stopped in the space between the edge of the crowd and the center of the square where Grok stood. Her father looked at her face for a long time. His expression was not the controlled blankness from the ceremony. His jaw was not set. He looked at her the way he had for that 3-second window in the clan square, the complicated expression that had been too fast to read, but now it had the space to be fully itself. And it was not complicated after all. It was very simple. It was relief. 4 years of fear and planning and sleepless nights, and the look of it in her father's face was just relief. Her mother's eyes went first to her forehead and then to her face, and then she made a sound that Grok had never heard her make before. Just a single, small sound, bitten back immediately, and she went to her knees. Not in shame. Grok understood this clearly and without doubt. The gesture was not apology or degradation. It was the gesture her grandmother had described in one of the old songs she had taught her. The gesture of recognition that members of the shamanic tradition used to acknowledge what was in front of them. Her mother had known this gesture. She had known it for years and kept it waiting for this. Her father followed. Side by side, both of them on their knees in the clan square, in front of a daughter they had expelled a week ago from this same square, while Gorath sat against the founding stone and could not seem to stand back up. The crowd was completely silent. She stood in the center of the square for a long moment and felt the ground under her feet, present in it, fully present, all the way down to the stone memory of the place she was standing in. Then she looked at her mother and said, "Get up. We have a lot to talk about." There are things that happen quickly and things that happen slowly, and the events that followed belonged to the second kind. Gorath did not hold his position for long after that afternoon. Not because she took it from him. She had no interest in the mechanics of clan governance, and she told him so directly when they spoke, in a conversation that was more civil than either of them had expected. She had gone to see him the morning after her return, alone, while the clan was still processing what had happened in the square. He had been sitting in his house with the shutters open, which was unusual for him, and he had not looked surprised to see her at the door. They had talked for most of that morning, about the bloodline, about what he had known and when, about the 4 generations of suppression that had preceded his tenure, and that he had continued, in his own way, for reasons he gave to her with a clarity that she had not expected. He had believed what he had been taught to believe. He had been handed a framework by the elder before him, who had been handed it by the elder before that. And the framework said that the old shamanic tradition was dangerous in specific ways. Unpredictable, impossible to integrate into functional clan governance, a source of division and instability in communities that needed stability. He had managed the clan well by most measures. He had kept them fed and defended through 2 difficult decades. He was not, as she sat across from him in his house, obviously evil. He was a man who had made his peace with removing things that inconvenienced him by convincing himself that the removal was for the general good. She understood this. She did not forgive it. Those were different things, and she was clear enough in herself by then to keep them distinct. The reasons he gave to the clan were vague, but the people who watched him closely said he had been different since the day he sat down in the square. Quieter, less certain of himself, as though something he had believed in firmly had been removed from him, and he had not yet found something to replace it. The clan did not collapse without him. It adapted, the way communities adapt when the thing holding them in a particular shape is taken away. Gradually and with more resilience than anyone expected. Her parents stayed. She did not forgive them in the sudden, clean way stories sometimes describe forgiveness. That was not honest to how it actually went. What happened instead was that they talked, many times over many months, and she understood more with each conversation, and the understanding was not the same as forgiveness, but it was adjacent to it, and getting closer. And that was enough to work with. She went back to the hut in the Ashenwood. She went frequently, and sometimes she stayed for days at a time, and the scrolls on the shelves slowly gave up their contents to her. Yurka's presence was there when she needed it, less often as time went on. Not leaving, but quieting. The way a teacher quiets when the student no longer needs the same kind of guidance. Once, sitting in the center of the floor with her palms flat against the stone, she went deeper into the land's memory than she had gone before. And she found Kishara. Not the fragments she had seen earlier, but something more complete. She found the afternoon when Kishara had built the chest and carved the lid, and stood back and looked at what she had made. She could not see Kishara's face clearly, even this deep. The past is like that. The further back you go, the more the specific features blur, while the feelings remain sharp. She could feel what Kishara felt in that moment. Not satisfaction exactly, though that was part of it. Something more patient. The feeling of a person who has done the thing they were supposed to do, who has gotten it into the world in whatever imperfect form they could manage, and who knows that the rest of it is out of their hands now. 200 years of waiting. 200 years of the hut sitting in its clearing, sealed, unchanged, the stone holding the record of the moment it was made and every moment after. And in all that time, the door had not opened for anyone. Until it opened for her. She came up from the vision slowly, the way she had practiced, choosing the return, arriving back in her own body with the ground under her palms and the light in the walls steady around her. She sat in the hut for a while longer after that, not thinking anything in particular, just being in the place, in the quiet of it, in the 200 years of patience that had been spent on her account. Then she got up and went back to the clan, because there was work to do, and she was the one to do it.